City zoning regulations usually place a lot of importance on preserving the character of neighborhoods. This could include building styles and materials, but more importantly it includes rules about more functional properties, like building height, lot coverage, and whether you can build detached, semi-detached, or multifamily homes. Denser housing is very often banned or restricted, with the justification that it doesn't fit with the existing low-density character of neighborhoods. Some cities have neighborhood character provisions that apply in addition to regular zoning rules. One Toronto homeowner applied to redevelop their detached home into a triplex, but despite their land being zoned to allow triplexes, their application was rejected because triplexes didn't already exist in the neighborhood, and so a triplex would not be consistent with the established character of the neighborhood. This was based on Toronto's OPA 320, a policy from 2015 that strengthens protections for the existing built form of neighborhoods. In this video, we're going to cover some of the problems with how cities think about and legislate neighborhood character.
The first problem with zoning to preserve neighborhood character is that locking down a neighborhood to one level of density runs counter to the ways cities naturally grow through densification. People in the urbanist space like to debate about the ideal density, and there is a certain baseline needed for a city that wants to be financially and environmentally sustainable. But beyond that, there's no one singular correct level of density. Density is about how much housing you get from a particular amount of land, which really has to depend on the demand for housing and the availability of land. As a city grows in population, and amenities and land become more sought after and scarce, it increasingly makes sense to use land more efficiently by building denser housing. If zoning rules or community groups are going to block this natural process of incremental densification, maybe we have to plan around that by being more careful about what lower density housing we allow to be built in the first place.
Another problem with our approach to neighborhood character is that avoiding change can be a mirage. Committing to keeping the buildings and housing supply the same often just forces change into other areas. The low-density neighborhoods in Toronto, Vancouver, or San Francisco that are protected by strict zoning might physically look the same as they did in decades past, but they're radically less affordable and more exclusive. Existing homeowners don't experience this change, and if they don't plan on moving soon, they might not even be particularly aware of it, but it's very real. Sometimes a failure to build more housing means that your population actually declines, which is the reality for so many neighborhoods in Toronto, because households are shrinking and not enough new homes are being built to counteract that. For example, in House Divided, the authors explain that Seton Village, a neighborhood in the West End of Toronto, had a population of 9,200 people in 1971, but today the area is only home to 5,600 people. This is a very central and desirable neighborhood, close to transit, parks, and a myriad of other amenities. But because there's not enough density, thousands of people are missing out on the experience of living there. This problem also leads to underutilized schools. Central Tech in Harvard Village has just over 1,000 students on a campus built for almost 3,000. Schools like this cost the Toronto School Board millions of dollars a year, prompting the government to consider closures, which are understandably unpopular among parents, but they're a result of trying to keep the physical character of the neighborhood the same. All of this is happening at the same time that schools are overflowing in parts of the city where more development is allowed.
A third problem with zoning to preserve neighborhood character is that it's based on status quo bias. People usually want things to stay the same. And when change is proposed, they tend to focus disproportionately on the possible harms over the possible benefits. But when change actually happens, people are surprisingly capable of getting used to it or even liking it. Many people will tell you that taller buildings would ruin the character of Montreal's neighborhoods of low-rise walk-up apartments. But the interesting thing is that many of these neighborhoods already have some tall buildings, and it doesn't seem like very many people spend their time lamenting them or wishing they were never built. Maybe someone out there is still grumpy about these buildings, but generally they're just seen as regular parts of the neighborhood. Now that we can see people living there, the benefits feel concrete. Sometimes these buildings even blend in to the point that if someone asked you if there was a relatively tall building somewhere, you might have to give it some thought. The same principle applies to transit infrastructure. It's easy to worry about the aesthetics or noise when elevated rail lines like the REM are proposed in Montreal, but no one in Vancouver really wishes the SkyTrain wasn't built.
The next problem with zoning to preserve neighborhood character is that often it's just based on excluding or hiding certain types of people. We saw this in the case of Toronto's ban on basement apartments having their own front door, that we covered in a past video, done out of the idea that multiple front doors are a threat to the character of neighborhoods. This is bizarre because a second front door is not a major aesthetic feature. It changes the look of a home less than having a garage, or regular variation in building materials, but because it's associated with renters, it's given a special significance. Maybe you say the neighborhood character is also determined by who lives there, and introducing renters would change that character. But basement apartments are already legal. This policy only affects their visibility. Also, more importantly, you can have your personal preferences and prejudices about who you want to live near, but it's just not a legitimate function of government power to enforce that. The government should not be in the business of preserving neighborhoods as exclusive fiefdoms, available only to those lucky enough to have a lot of money, or be old enough to have bought into the neighborhood when it was more affordable. Homeowners are not children, and we're not playing finders keepers. You own your home, but we have to share the city.
Our final problem with zoning to preserve neighborhood character is that enforcing sameness makes difference stand out. Going back to the example of the proposed triplex in Toronto, a critic could say that a 3-story home would stand out on a street of mostly 1-story buildings. And they're not entirely wrong, to the extent that that matters. But if you had other 2- and 3-story buildings, they would stop standing out and they'd just be a regular part of the neighborhood. The same thing applies to other building properties, like color. If all homes on a street are the same color, then one exception to that would stand out and maybe look out of place. But if you have many homes of different colors, it becomes just a normal part of the neighborhood. Rows of colorful houses actually end up very popular. Whether we're talking about San Francisco, Montreal, Newfoundland, Scotland, or Scandinavia.
If this video gives you the impression that we don't care about neighborhood character, that couldn't be further from the truth. As you can see from all the footage we take, we love walking and exploring neighborhoods. It's one of our main hobbies, and a big source of inspiration for things to talk about on this channel. We love seeing interesting architecture and design, good public art, welcoming parks and public spaces, unique small businesses, intriguing alleyways, and so on. These things make neighborhoods better to live in and visit. However, neighborhood character is many things, not just old or traditional buildings, or whatever a neighborhood happened to look like in 1979. Character building, much like in people, is an evolving process that must take into account the needs of the moment, and it should be a proactive and dynamic process, not a reflexive opposition to change. And it definitely should not be an excuse to use the law to exclude people.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to build your neighborhood character while spelling neighborhood the Canadian way with a U, and subscribe. And a special thanks goes out to our supporters on Patreon.